Well, I can't teach you all the book of Daniel, but I can tell you this. In Daniel chapter 8, there's a prophecy of a ram that has 2 horns, and then a goat that comes up with 4. Now in Daniel, it happens to be the case that the horns represent kings. And that ram represents the country of Persia. How do we know that? Well, because God told us that in Daniel chapter 8. He told us that. The ram represents Persia. And the goat has 4 horns, and the goat, we're told, represents Grecia. And what it is a prophecy of the coming time of the empire of Persia, followed by a coming time of the empire of Greece. That's what it's about. And the ram with 2 horns, one horn has the larger horn comes up later. That's because the first king of that empire was the smaller king. The latter king of that empire was Cyrus. He was the larger king, the more powerful king. And he's the one that begins that received the kingdom from Babylon. Follow that? Some of you, I've gone over this many times, gold, silver, so on, and the transfer of the kingdom. Well, Cyrus is the one who took the kingdom from Babylon. So he was the king at that time. He's the larger of the 2 horns. Well, then this goat comes, and that's Grecia. And Grecia attacks the ram and tramples it all to pieces and breaks it all down. And then the 1 horn out of the goat, we are told, is the first king of Grecia, and that is Alexander the Great. And so that horn is broken, and then because he was broken, and then 4 horns came up in the place of the 1 horn, and those are the 4 kings who divided up Alexander's kingdom. See? And those guys go on all the way to the end, and so he talks about the latter time of their kingdom, and the whole point is that out of one of those horns comes little horn or Antichrist. Or so my point here is, when you look at Daniel and you study all these references to prophetic time, every single one of them that we've looked at so far focuses on a time when little horn, Antichrist, man of sin, son of perdition, comes up on the scene. Isn't that interesting? Now, why do I find that so interesting? Well, we have Jesus Christ appearing at the dispensation of the fullness of times. According to Daniel's prophecies, you would think the fullness of times would be when all the times he talked about were coming together to their fullness, were coming to completion, or were ready to be fulfilled. There's another way to put it. They were full or ready. The time had come when the prophecies of Daniel were ready to be fulfilled. Well, see, now here's the thing. We know that Christ showed up at this time, and not the Antichrist. So what's going on here? Well, and remember, Daniel interpreted the vision, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, the gold head, the silver torso, the belly of brass and thighs of brass. Every time you see these pictures, you always get this guy wearing a miniskirt. His brass skirt should go all the way down to his knees, like every young lady should dress. Of course, that's not a young lady, but anyway, my point is, it's the belly and thighs of the image. It's supposed to be brass. Then you have the legs, and that's iron. Then you have the feet, iron mixed with miry clay. Then you got the 10 little tootsies, which are also clay and iron. And remember, the golden head represents what country? Babylon. That's right. God had taken the kingdom from who? Israel. From who? Very good, class. And he gave it to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And then that degenerated down. Oh, by the way, remember this is a little bit of review, he called Nebuchadnezzar his servant, didn't he? Nebuchadnezzar, my servant. So God was giving and what did God say during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar? In Daniel chapter 4, 3 times. In Daniel 5, he says it again, verse 21. He says, God rules in the kingdoms of men and gives it to whomever he will, doesn't it? You need to pay attention to that language, that specific language. God said 3 times in Daniel 4 that God rules in the kingdoms of men and He gives it to whomever He will. Did you hear that? He prophesies through Nebuchadnezzar's dream the procession of the kingdom all the way down until his own son comes to rule and reign on the earth. He calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant. He gave the kingdom to his servant. You come to the next kingdom. That's the silver torso. And that is Persia. And that was Cyrus was the first king. And God took it from Babylon and gave it to Cyrus. God called Cyrus His servant. Didn't He? All right. Now we know from Daniel 10 there's spiritual warfare going on during all of this, where the devil and his angels are fighting against God and His angels. And you see that in Daniel chapter 10, and they're in warfare. And they're warring over control of these kingdoms. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get control of the kingdom. And the way the devils do it is by corrupting the heart of the kings until they do something to blaspheme, and then God, in judgment, takes the kingdom from them and gives it to another of His servants. Well, what would happen if you came to a time when God didn't have a servant to give it to? What if you came to a time when there wasn't anybody on earth who could be identified as God's servant? Watch what happens. God gives it to Babylon. Babylon loses it. God gives it to Cyrus, His servant. He does not name Alexander as His servant, does He? God prophesied about him and identified him so clearly the Jews recognized him. But he's not named. Nebuchadnezzar's name, Cyrus's name. Cyrus was named before Nebuchadnezzar was, by the way. Did you know that in prophecy? Cyrus was named 100 years before this all came up. About 50 years before Nebuchadnezzar was born. Cyrus was already named. God foresaw Cyrus a long time before and called him my shepherd and my servant. These were God's servants, these two men. Now they were heathen men, but they were God's servants. It's something, I'm laying stuff down and I come back and explain something and give you more, filling in more blanks. That's my teaching strategy. Hope you like it. Because you'll learn that way. But there are some questions I will answer some of that later on. But let's just stay where we are right now, what's on the schedule for today. And so here we are. And God takes it from Nebuchadnezzar, or from his kingdom, and He gives it to Cyrus. And then that kingdom degenerates to the point of blasphemy. And then they are conquered by Greece. Why didn't God name this third king? You couldn't see far enough? You've heard me tease about this. Did God get early onset of Alzheimer's? You begin to slip a little bit, He can't see quite as far as He used to? No, there is a very important reason He didn't name this king. And it's going to show up in just a little bit. This Grecian kingdom's a long one. The first king gets cut off pretty quick because of his blasphemy, by the way. And then you have 4 kings, and his kingdom is divided up into 4, but it extends all the way down to the kneecaps. All right? The transition between the Grecian and the, most people say Roman, but you've heard me explain why that's not quite right. It's true that Rome is the 4th empire to come up when you count from Babylon. But it isn't true that the 4th kingdom should be called Rome, because it will be called by a lot of different names, as you've heard me explain. And mostly because God didn't call it Rome. And for all the same reasons, God didn't slip, and forget and oops and well I should have, and no, He didn't on purpose. And we are making a mistake if we supply something God didn't give us permission to supply. I think it's a mistake. And you'll see why it's a mistake. Watch, it's interesting. Because you get down here at this transition period, which is kind of blurry. There's not a clear-cut place. Most people point to Pompeii, some will point to the first Caesar, some will, you go all over the place trying to figure out when does this 4th kingdom start. And everybody's best guess, I think, is with Pompeii. Why? Because Jerusalem seems to be the focal point each time, but all of that are surmises. We don't have any Bible for that. So and isn't it interesting that during Paul's time, he doesn't say that the gospel, he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the gospel of salvation unto the Jew first and also to the Romans. Also to the Greeks. So we're still in reference to the Grecian kingdom here. Not necessarily meaning we haven't entered into fourth kingdom stuff. It's just that there's this interesting transition here between third and fourth kingdom that's real fuzzy and murky. It's hard to really clarify. The Grecian influence we know from Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 8 extends all the way to the end. Because it's in the latter days of their kingdom, the four horns, that Antichrist shows up. So their kingdom is continuing. And that would explain why we're still talking about Greece even at this time. And yet, it's interesting that that's still the dominant influence in the culture and influence force in the world. The Grecian Empire is still having a very significant place. Now watch how this happens. Here's what I'm going to show you. Luke chapter 4, verse 5 through 7. Look at that. Luke chapter 4, beginning at verse 5. And the devil, taking him up into an high mountain, showed unto him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said unto him, all this power will I give thee, and the glory of them. Now read carefully the next clause. For that is delivered unto me, and to whomsoever I will, I give it. Very interesting. Did you read that carefully? Exactly. What did God say over and over and over again by the prophet Daniel at the time of the first transfer of the kingdom to the Gentiles? When God first took the kingdom from His own people and gave it to the Gentiles. And the times of the Gentiles began. What did God establish? Like He went out of His way. The first 6 chapters of Daniel have this as its main primary message. God is still on the throne, and He's in control, and He gives the kingdoms to whomever He will.